I don't believe that if I was armed, it would have done anything that day. I was on CNN several days after the incident at my school opposite a sheriff from Ohio, and he agreed with me and very plainly said on television that if I had a gun and it was out of my reach by the time I would have gone to go get it, I would have been shot and killed.
There was an armed guard outside the very school that this lady was working at, and yet he didn't stop the shooter. Why would a teacher be in any better position to stop a shooter coming in with an AR-15 than an armed security guard?
Well, because the studies of decades of this type of violence have shown that the way that you save lives when these type of violent situations start is time is the only thing that matters. The sooner that you can stop the killing, and then secondly have the medical tools and training there to stop the dying by providing medical care, that's how we save lives in these situations.
How many mass shootings in America? How many mass shootings in America? And by mass shooting, let's take it, say 10 deaths or more in the last 20 years have been stopped by somebody with a gun, by a civilian with a gun?
They've been stopped by civilians at least 70% of the time, whether they're armed
hang on.
or not.
I just asked you to name.
That is the.
I'm asking about the number of.
No, that's what we've found.
Well, I'm very familiar with the number of mass shootings in America going back 20 years that involved the deaths of more than 10 people in one incident. How many of those incidents were stopped by a civilian with a gun? Tell me one.
Well, if you're looking for civilians with a gun, that's a whole different number than being stopped by civilians.
But teachers
and what we know
civilian,
is that any time that you allow these killings to continue beyond...
Mr. Eaton, you just said 70% of these incidents... Yeah, with respect, sir, you just said 70% are stopped by people with guns.
30% of those...
But they weren't, though, were they?
What I said is that 70% of them are stopped before law enforcement can arrive.
The truth is that none of the mass shootings involving 10 deaths or more in the last 20 years in America have been stopped by any civilians with guns. This despite the fact that America has more civilian gun ownership than the next 20 richest countries in the world put together. Right? So my point to you is, why do you... Let me ask my question.
But the fact of the matter...
Why, given that no civilians ever actually stop these mass shootings, why do you now want to risk the lives of children in schools by arming teachers with the obvious risks? I mean, that lady we just saw in the clip, with a gun and a loaded firearm and 2 magazines attached to her waist...
Is there a question here?
I'm coming to the question. Why do you think a teacher armed in a classroom is going to stop anybody?
How long are you going to let the violence continue before you do something, anything?
You keep saying they all get stopped. They don't get stopped. That's my point. And here's my second point to you. In New York, a few years ago, they did a survey into armed police marksmen. And they discovered that in practice...
Yes, police hit about 17% of the time, and that's just a specious argument.
Let the viewers decide how specious it was. In practice, their accuracy rates were 80% or higher. In live shooting situations, it fell to 17%. These are New York, highly trained police marksmen. Why would a teacher who would be nowhere near, even under your program, as highly trained as these police officers, be any, say, more than 10% accurate? Let's give them a benefit of 10%, which means that 9 out of 10 of the bullets they fire, and that woman had 2 magazines on her, will be fired in a classroom of children where she has a 90% failed accuracy rate. Tell me why that is safe.
Will I be able to answer? That is safe because as soon as a killer is confronted, they stop focusing on innocent victims. And sometimes that's simply somebody in authority. And you say these have never been stopped. We saw it right here at Chardon High School where there were no shots fired. We've seen it at Madison High School where it just so happened that the security guard was able to get in there in 9 seconds and stop the killing, so there were no dead in that incident. The fact of the matter is, the longer you let the violence continue, the more dead or injured, and we're tired of watching our kids die, so we're doing everything we can to shorten that timeline. Stop the killing, provide the medical aid, and that's how you save lives in these situations.
Why don't you get rid of guns? You have over 300 million guns in circulation. I know it's a laughable suggestion,
You
but
know,
let me
Piers,
just put
you can work on that. You can wake up in a fantasy land tomorrow. We're helping schools that have real situations and real problems right now.
Well, we had
to be in a
the
fantasy
reason
land
I
where
ask
these
you,
school
the
shootings
reason I
never
ask
happen.
you is we had a mass shooting at a school in Britain in 1996, in which 16 children were killed. Very similar, very sadly, to what happened at Sandy Hook.
Just look at the bridge or the Westminster or the Cumbria. You still have violence when this occurs. If we all woke up in a fantasy land tomorrow where every gun had magically disappeared, there would still be people committing violence, and we still need to have a solution for when this violence comes into our schools, our churches, or our businesses.
I remember what happened at your school vividly, and it was utterly horrendous. I also remember that the armed security man, whose only job it was to stop such an incident, was so terrified he basically took fright. And he's an armed security man.
Right.
I cannot imagine what it would be like for a teacher. You were there. Tell us what goes through your head, your mind. What is the reaction?
A gun would have done no good for me that day. I was not in building 12. I was in building 6, but from my classroom, I could see building 12, and I look at it every day. And I know what went on in that building, and I know the classrooms that were affected. And one of my coworkers who I've taught with for 13 years was shot, and a gun would not have helped her that day. A gun would not have helped the teachers who were ambushed on the first floor of that building. A gun would have done me no good because it would have been locked safely in a closet so that my students wouldn't have had access to it. And by the time I would have gotten to that gun, had the shooter entered my classroom, I would have been shot dead. I have 2 children of my own. I don't want to send them to a school where their teachers are armed. This is my 17th year of teaching. I will never own a gun. I will never carry a gun, and I will never bring a gun to school. It's not safe. It doesn't solve anything.
There's at least one teacher who, if violence comes into that school tomorrow, is going to go willingly stand between these murderers with a rifle and these kids. And right now, they're going to give up their lives. If teachers love their kids that much, we owe it to that staff to say, what can we do to help you go home to your family at the end of the night also? That's what these teachers want to do. Some teachers, such as the one that we're talking to now, would never want to be a part of this program. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But other teachers that want the medical training, let's get them the medical training. Other teachers who want every tool and every ability they can to keep these kids safe and so they can go home at the end of the night, we need to talk to those teachers, work with those teachers, and find a way that they can safely and effectively implement this type of program.
To imply that I would not do anything in my power to save my students simply because I don't want to be armed is absolutely ludicrous. I saved the lives of 15 children that day,
I said that you chose not to have a firearm.
I choose not to have a firearm, but it does not in any way mean that I would not do anything possible to save my students and keep them safe. And I can tell you that my friends in that building would not have been a match with a pistol, a handgun, to an AR-15 that was staring at them from the end of the hallway. It's clear to me that you've never been a classroom teacher.
That's just an uninformed opinion.
And you don't understand. Have you been a teacher?
I have taught
Have
not
you been
in
a
the public
teacher?
school education system, but I have taught, yes.
Mr. Eaton, let me ask you this.
Okay, so
let me ask him this, Mr. Eaton. The AR-15 is now the preferred weapon of choice for most mass shooters in America. Most of the massacres we read about, almost inevitably now, they have an AR-15. It's a semi-automatic rifle capable of being used very light, very easy, very fast. You can fire up to 100 bullets a minute. With bump fire stock, you can make it 300-400 bullets a minute. Has it crossed your mind at any stage of all this that rather than arming teachers with the inherent risk to kids in the classrooms, that you might actually ban deranged people or people with nefarious reasons from having or the ability to have an AR-15? Why don't you just ban military-style assault rifles from civilian use? Has that crossed your mind?
Oh, it has, but it's a non-starting argument because, again, they are already banned from criminal use. I mean, you can't make murder any more illegal. That's just an insane argument that making something more illegal is going to change any of this.
So when you get
what matters 100% is that what matters is that when the violence occurs, the victims...
Mr. Eaton, do you drink when you get in the car?
When the victims...
Mr. Eaton, do you drink when you get in the car?
When the victims...
Do you drink alcohol before you drive?
No, you don't drink when you get in the
Okay.
car.
Do you put a
I don't
safety
drink.
belt? Do you put a safety belt on when you get in a car?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so you take reasonably safe procedure measures before you get in a car, yeah? Because it's a dangerous...
That's why I carry a firearm, and I encourage my family members and friends to carry a firearm.
Okay.
Because the only thing that matters, you can pass any laws you want, and when violence comes to a person, the only thing that matters is that crime victim had the chance to decide how to keep themselves and their families safe.
I
Not
think
has some politician pushing their things taken away those options. Only thing that matters is, did I have every choice that I want to keep myself alive?
Yeah, so the answer is not to try and remove the weapons of war from these people. It's just
To give more of them out.
It's to sell more guns by giving teachers guns. That's the answer. More guns.